Good afternoon, everyone. You are very welcome to this episode of Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar. My name is Ciara Stagg, and I'm the Alumni Relations Officer here at Trinity Development and Alumni, and I'm your host for today. I'm so excited to introduce you to today's topic, which is with Professor Jane Stout. We're going to be talking all about the current global biodiversity crisis, what it matters to human health, and what we can all do to help with it. And now, before I introduce Professor Jane Stout, we just have a few technical things I need to go through for today's webinar. Today's webinar will be just under 1 hour. The talk itself will be 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. Now, we really encourage you to participate as much as possible and pop questions in throughout the webinar as you think of them. If you'd like to ask a question, just click the button below that says Q&A. We are using Zoom-generated automatic subtitles today, and if you would like to avail of them, just click the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Click Hide and then Show to see the subtitles. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for future playback on the Trinity Alumni YouTube channel. Now, without further ado, let me introduce today's guest speaker, the fabulous Professor Jane Stout. Professor Jane Stout is an internationally renowned expert on pollinator and pollination ecology and Trinity College Dublin's Vice President for Biodiversity and Climate Action. She's a prominent voice for biodiversity and its value, and Jane's research seeks to understand how land management practices, including agricultural and urbanization, affect ecological processes and the benefits of natures for human. Jane works across disciplines and with public and private organisations to improve environmental policy and practice. She leads a large team of researchers on the Plant-Animal Interactions Research Group in botany in the School of Natural Sciences in Trinity, and she's the co-founder and former chair of the board of Irish Forum on Natural Capital and co-founder and deputy chair of the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. Now I'm going to pass over to Jane for her talk, and I'll see you all later.
Thank you, Ciara. Thanks for the introduction. And hi, everyone. It's a bit like teaching during lockdown. I know you're all there, but I can't see you. So now I am just going to share my screen. And hopefully you can see that now. You see the title slide. Great. Okay, well, thanks for having me today. And as Ciara said, what I want to talk about is about biodiversity, about its loss, what impact that loss has on us and what we're doing about it. And really the title of the talk here, Human Nature, Opening the Front Gate to Biodiversity, is really to make that point that human and nature aren't separate, that we're deeply intertwined, and that at Trinity we're really both symbolically and actually opening our front gate to biodiversity, and I'll come to that towards the end. So I thought I'd start with this word biodiversity. We hear this word biodiversity, but a lot of people can be unsure as to what it actually means. It's very sciencey. The sciencey definition of it is the variety of life. So we're talking about diversity of habitats, of species, diversity at a genetic level within the populations. So this audience represents biodiversity. We are all different because we are genetically different individuals, even though we're all the same species. So when we think about biodiversity, we can think about diversity at the habitat level. So that the pictures on the slide here show coastal grasslands, urban meadows, wetlands, uplands. These different types of habitats give us biodiversity. And then within each of those habitats, there are all the different organisms living in them. So this is the plants, the animals, the microorganisms. They are also biodiversity. And then, as I said, the diversity within species, within populations at the genetic level is also biodiversity as well. So when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about nature, but we're specifically talking about this variety or this variation in nature. And what's happening is we're undergoing a global loss of biodiversity. And this has really happened I suppose, in quite a quiet way, the sort of the gradual or the silent chip away of nature as we expand urban populations across the planet. So every time we develop some land for infrastructure, for housing, for agriculture, then we chip away at this biodiversity. And what we've ended up with is these quite homogenized or quite simplified landscapes. So the pictures on the left really show how these landscapes can be homogenized through this process of losing bits and pieces of natural elements of habitat from the landscape. And the image on the right really just to try and emphasize that on farmland. I think, you know, many of us when we were young remember farmland with patches of woodland, with streams, with ditches, with big hedgerows. And a lot of that has gone through increased mechanization, increased efficiencies, and also through policies that have undervalued these kind of habitats. So this biodiversity loss has happened kind of quietly, gradually, but it is a problem, not just in Ireland, it's happening globally. So this is a really important report that was published in 2019 by IPBES, which is the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services equivalent of the IPCC. So the IPCC does all the global climate assessments. The IPBES does all the global biodiversity and ecosystem services assessments. And the first comprehensive global assessment of biodiversity came with these conclusions that 75% of the land area of the whole Earth is very significantly altered by human activity, that 2/3 of our oceans areas are experiencing increasing impacts, and that more than 85%, so nearly all of wetland area globally has been lost. So it's been drained, it's been destroyed, it's been changed by human activity. So this is what constitutes our biodiversity crisis, this simplification, modification of our natural systems. And in terms of species, so quite often when we think about biodiversity loss, we think about species loss. We think about species of frogs or butterflies or plants that are going extinct. You know, we probably think about the Amazon rainforests or some exotic location. But this is happening globally in terms of species loss. And this graph that I've just put on the slide here, which shows, you might have come across this, the Global Living Planet Index, and recently there's a very high profile report that showed that nearly 70%, so 69% decline in animal populations since the early 1970s. And again, this really puts this in context for me, because this is during my lifetime. There's been this 69% decline in numbers of wild vertebrate animals. And across all species globally, the same report that I just mentioned that talked about habitats being threatened came up with this statistic of that 1 million of the estimated 8 million species that there are on Earth are threatened with extinction. So 1 in 8 species at risk of extinction. So 1 million species that have taken millions of years to evolve on this planet are being lost in a few short decades. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about biodiversity loss of habitats, modification, alteration of habitats, and this risk and threat to species with declines in the size of populations, and also risks of extinction. And this, unfortunately, isn't just happening elsewhere. This is also a problem in Ireland. So of our protected species and habitats, so we have quite good conservation legislation at a European level through the nature directives. And we have to report periodically as a country back to the EU on how we're doing in terms of the species and habitats that are protected under these directives. And unfortunately, in Ireland, we're not doing particularly well. 30% of our protected species are in bad or inadequate condition, and 85% of our protected habitat types are in bad or inadequate condition. So we're not doing particularly well. And even though when we look at the countryside of Ireland, it looks green, it looks diverse, it looks like it's not doing too badly, our protected habitats and species are not in good shape. And agricultural incentives and development, as I've just mentioned, have contributed to habitat loss, this simplification of the landscape. And of course, when we lose habitat, when we lose particular little different parts of different kinds of habitats, then we lose the species that live there. And in Ireland, there's an estimated 31,500 different species. And yet we actually only know the conservation status of about 10% of those. So for 90% of the species that live on the island of Ireland, we just don't know enough about their conservation status. We don't know how they're doing. Of those species that we have assessed, and we know something about their conservation status, 1 in 5 are at risk of extinction. So this is higher than this global estimate of 1 in 8. And in some groups in Ireland, so in the bees, for example, it's as high as 1 in 3 species at risk of extinction. So we have a real challenge in Ireland in terms of biodiversity. We have biodiversity loss happening even if we don't notice it. And the main drivers of this biodiversity loss are the same in Ireland as they are elsewhere in globally. So loss of habitat, as I've mentioned, by conversion and by clearance, pollution, both from industry, but also in terms of waste. And we're all familiar with plastic pollution, but also pollution in terms of agrochemicals. Overexploitation, so this is overhunting and fishing, so basically taking individuals out of a population at a faster rate than it can recover, basically demand outstripping supply. Invasive species, so these are new arrivals that can cause damage, disease and degradation to native organisms and their habitats, and of course climate change. And these things are driven by not only our agricultural systems, but our extraction of resources, the spread of urbanization, and all of these things are ultimately driven by increasing population size, overconsumption, and inefficiency. So a large-scale inefficiency in the way we use our resources. But also there are other influences, our institutions, our governance, all of these things together are driving this biodiversity loss. So what? I suppose the question is, why does that matter? Why does that make any difference to our day-to-day lives? Well, we know that nature is our life support system and it's fundamental to human life. So nature provides the air we breathe, the water that we need and the food that we need to sustain us, and materials for shelter and protecting us against the elements. So without nature, without diversity in nature, humanity wouldn't be able to exist. But it's also really important for our health. So it provides us with medical compounds. It contributes towards the detoxification of poisons. It provides us with analogues for which we can start to understand human diseases and human health. It protects us against natural hazards like floods and soil erosion, contributes to spirituality and culture, provides opportunities for leisure and recreation. It gives us our luxuries, so cosmetics, textiles, things that are important to us like chocolate and coffee are able to be produced because of biodiversity. So biodiversity isn't just a nice to have, it is our life support system. And these benefits that humanity gets from healthy ecosystems and from biodiversity are known as ecosystem services, or in the IPBES language, they're known as nature's contributions to people. So these are all the things that benefit us, benefit humanity, benefit society, that come from biodiversity are known as these ecosystem services. And some, as I've mentioned, are fundamental to life. So in the bottom of this wheel of benefits here in brown are things that are fundamental. So the production of oxygen, nutrient cycles, soils, all of these things absolutely fundamental to underpinning the other services we receive. The ones in blue are the ones we often think about in terms of what do we get from nature. These are the goods, so food, water, timber, biochemicals, medicines, and other things shown here in blue. And other things are essential for our well-being. So shown here in yellow, so mental and physical health, education, nice places to live, all of these things benefit our well-being. And then all the other benefits in green are help to regulate the planet. So including climate regulation, pest regulation, disease regulation, filtering out pollutants, providing clean water, all of those kind of things. So biodiversity means that we exist. It also contributes indirectly and directly to our health. It provides these goods and services, but there's also an intangible existence value. So we like to know that biodiversity exists. We may never visit the Indonesian rainforests and see orangutans, but we still want to know that they exist. So even if we never use it or never see it, biodiversity is important to us as a species. And it can have, as I said, cultural, sacred, and moral worth as well. So the gradual and incremental loss of biodiversity means that the supply of all of these services slows down and is at risk of stopping. And I mentioned climate regulation in there as an important thing we get from biodiversity, because of course we're all very familiar with the climate crisis. How does this crisis of biodiversity line up with the all too familiar climate crisis? Well, the climate crisis is, as you probably know, a gradual increase in global temperatures. And you can see for this graph here for Ireland, these are average annual temperatures relative to the average from 1971 to 2000, so the end of the last century. And we can see that in the first 2 decades of this century, temperatures have been considerably warmer. And the most recent IPCC Working Group 1 report states that we're likely to exceed the 1.5 degrees warming that we globally were trying to remain within. We're likely to exceed this in the early 2030s. And this is enough to cause irreversible damage to biodiversity and ecosystems. And we've already seen the impacts of, so far, a 1.1 degree increase in global climate. We've already seen those impacts. They impact nature, they impact our infrastructures, and impact our livelihoods. So sudden extreme weather events, floods, fires, droughts, storms, all of these things are driven by or exacerbated by climate change. And loss of biodiversity affects our ability to cope with these changes. So biodiversity can help to slow carbon release in the first place. So this picture here is of Liffey Head Bog. You can see Pure Mast in the distance there on the horizon. And bogs like this are fantastic carbon sinks. So they retain carbon, prevent it from being lost to the atmosphere, but they also act as giant sponges. So they hold in the rainwater and release it slowly, and this helps to prevent flooding. And of course, these bogs provide habitats for plants and animals like birds that need these wild open spaces. And biodiversity can also help us cope with warmer climates. So as it gets warmer with climate change, particularly in urban areas, things like street trees can help to ameliorate increases in temperature in cities, cooling them in the summer, keeping them warmer in the winter. Coastal wetlands can help protect against storm surges. Wooded floodplains can attenuate floodwater, so hold the floodwater and prevent flooding. Vegetation holds the soil together, prevents erosion and soil loss. So, and diversity in ecosystems gives them a resilience. So one reason that biodiversity is really important in the face of climate change and other changes is that biodiversity can make ecosystems more stable. So that's less fluctuating from year to year, more resilient. So that means they can bounce back after a sudden event, and also more adaptable in the future in the face of climate change and other changes coming down the line. So diversity in ecosystems is really, really important in the face of climate change. And in fact, it's been suggested that we can't achieve our sustainable development goals, so we can't have this sustainable development in the future unless we succeed in the biosphere goals. So you're probably all familiar with the SDGs, the 17 global goals, and this image here has just rearranged them from a flat or a circle of goals into a kind of a pyramid of goals. And what it's trying to illustrate is that we can't get those economic goals or those societal goals achieved unless we make sure we also succeed in those biosphere goals. So we need to tackle the loss of biodiversity on land, in water, and we need to take action against climate change. And really, the other thing that this diagram illustrates is that, you know, if we get those biosphere goals right, then we can make sure that our societal goals are met and they underpin the economy. And the idea is that the economy isn't seen as a separate being to the biosphere, but that it's embedded within it. And so to achieve sustainable societies, we need sustainable natural systems. We need that biodiversity. And actually, unhealthy natural systems, the loss of biodiversity and climate change really does risk our businesses, our livelihoods, and our well-being. And this image comes from the World Economic Forum that every year produces a risk report, and this is from last month's risk report. And what we see this year is that the top 4 risks in terms of their likely impact, so the severity of the risk over the next 10 years, all of these are related to, the top 4 are all related to climate change and biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. So it's being recognised much more, coming to the front, that these issues are likely to have an impact on all of us. So we may think that our businesses have really no connection with biodiversity. It's easy to see how businesses that rely on natural resources or something like agriculture or forestry, you can see how that's linked to biodiversity. It's hard to see how other businesses actually have any link with biodiversity. But in fact, every business has some kind of dependence on biodiversity and some kind of impact on biodiversity. And that's just, this figure here is just trying to illustrate that, is that the inputs to every business in terms of materials, in terms of electricity or fuels, in terms of water, in terms of land use, all have dependencies on biodiversity. These inputs do whatever they do in the business activities, and then there's always outputs. So in terms of emissions, in terms of waste products, in terms of noise, in terms of wastewater, and again, these have impacts on biodiversity. So the point is that we all of us in society, as individuals, as a society, as businesses, all have impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. And globally, this has been recognised in the development of the post-2020 global framework on biodiversity. So this was the framework that was agreed at COP15 in December last year. So most people have heard of the climate COPs, and are surprised to know there's a biodiversity COP as well. So we had COP27 for climate last October, COP15 for biodiversity last December. And at this global meeting, this global biodiversity framework was agreed. And what it is a broad-based commitment to action to bring about transformation in our society's relationship with biodiversity by 2030. And really the vision is that by 2050, humanity lives in harmony with nature. And the Global Biodiversity Framework sets out targets for protecting marine and land habitats, and specific things like reducing pesticides and plastic waste, and importantly, increasing investment in biodiversity, which has been until now very, very much on the back foot. A lot of investment has gone into climate and climate action, but very little into biodiversity and biodiversity action. In the EU, we already had an ambitious biodiversity strategy. So the biodiversity strategy for Europe has this 30 by 30 ambition. So the idea that 30% of land and 30% of sea is protected by 2030 was in the EU biodiversity strategy. And not just protecting land, but restoring ecosystems that have been degraded as well. So this will be done by changing farming methods, by halting and reversing the decline of pollinators, by reducing the use and harmfulness of pesticides, by restoring rivers, and by planting 3 billion trees across the European Union by 2030. All of these things are massively challenging for the agricultural sector, for forestry, for river restoration, for infrastructure. Huge, huge challenges, but a strong commitment from the European Union. But it's not just the foresters, the fishers and the farmers that need to be concerned. It's a challenge for everyone. And to bend the curve on biodiversity loss, we can't just rely on conservation and restoration. So this diagram here is a diagrammatic representation of our current biodiversity loss. So with biodiversity kind of in free fall decline, if we want to bend that curve and stop the loss of biodiversity, but also increase biodiversity, then we can't just rely on conservation and restoration. We need to act against climate change, we need to cut pollution, we need more sustainable production, and we need reduced consumption. So this is what I mean, is it's not just the role of one sector of society, it's not just the role of conservation agencies, it's not just the role of farmers or agriculture, it's everyone. Everybody can play a part in restoring biodiversity. So what can we do here in Trinity? So we're a city centre campus. We have a relatively small land footprint, but tackling global biodiversity loss is definitely within our interests, within our interests in Trinity, but also within the Irish interests. For our well-being, our livelihoods, our economy, we need to start integrating biodiversity with other important issues of climate, of equality, diversity, and gender. We need joined up, cross-cutting action. We're all part of this global ecosystem, and we know it's going to be hard. There are going to be trade-offs, but we do have to make this effort. So what we're doing in Trinity, we're starting to assess our impacts and dependencies. So trying to find out what our biodiversity footprint is. So where are our biggest operational impacts? Where are the biggest dependencies in our supply chains? What are the biggest contributions, the positive contributions that we can make? And can we bring nature into our decision making? As I've said, it's not just a nice to have, it's a must have. But how do we bring it into decision making when decisions are made in general based on financial terms, not environmental ones? What we do have, I think, as a university is the potential to show leadership. We have some of the country's experts in peatland restoration, in financing biodiversity initiatives, in biodiversity and health. So we can lead the way in terms of research, we can lead the way in terms of influences and how businesses can tackle these issues. But also we have an obligation to our students, to the next generation, the generation that are going to have to cope with these problems, to embed this in the curriculum and to make changes so that everybody is educated, everybody knows what biodiversity is, why it's important to us, and what we can do about it. And then, of course, we need to work with others to tackle this global problem. So then I was thinking about, that's what Trinity needs to do. That sounds, it's going to be hard, and that's quite high level. What can individuals do? What can you do? You're giving up your lunchtime to listen to this webinar. What can you do to help? So I tried to bring it back to the individual. We can all try and do something to contribute to bending that curve on biodiversity loss. So things like reducing consumption. So don't buy stuff that you don't need. Reuse, recycle stuff that you no longer need, because this whole massive consumption is one of the problems. So reducing consumption is really important. Moving to more sustainable food, so less meat and dairy in your diet, more plant-based proteins, more organic food, grow your own food if you have the space and the ability to do that. Helping to cut pollution, so in your own day-to-day, using less disposables, walking or cycling, so having active travel for local journeys rather than jumping into the car. And really getting involved in the conservation of biodiversity in your local area. So most local areas have biodiversity initiatives. They might not be called biodiversity initiatives, but initiatives to try and restore and conserve biodiversity in the local area. And one of those initiatives, and Kira mentioned at the beginning, is that I was the co-founder of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And really what this is based on our research showing risks of extinction to pollinators. We developed this cross-sectoral action plan and a whole suite of evidence-based guidelines for specific sectors to make it clear what people can do. Because I think a lot of people want to do something, but just don't know where to start. So the Pollinator Plan really was targeted at giving people low-cost, pragmatic options that they can implement in their business, in their garden, in their local community, in their sports clubs. And there's a whole bunch of guidelines that are available on pollinators.ie. So that's just one way that we can help. And of course, it's not all about pollinators. I talk about pollinators a lot. That's my area of research. And of course, the pollinator plan addresses pollinators in particular. Pollinators are called out in the EU biodiversity strategy, but they're a really good example of where protecting and promoting one group of organisms may have lots of other benefits. So pollinators may help to pollinate your fruit trees or your vegetable crops in your garden, but they'll also pollinate wild plants, and many of these pollinating insects have other benefits in ecosystems, like recycling waste or being food to other wildlife. And then there's all the co-benefits that come with that. So all these other ecosystem services that I talked about earlier on, climate and soil regulation, keeping us healthy, providing nice places to live. So really, this approach is focusing on a single group of organisms that will have a wider benefit. And so whilst a lot of us may feel this way, and I love this cartoon, the small boy says, "We are so small." But yes, says the polar bear, but you can make a huge difference. And we often, as individuals, we think, what difference can we actually make? The planet's made up of 8 billion individuals. We can all do something. Governments, corporations, boards, they're made up of individuals. Individuals can make a huge difference, but a lot of it is working together. So I'll just finish by reiterating that biodiversity is not just a nice to have, it is our life support system. It urgently needs addressing. The loss of biodiversity needs addressing as urgently as the climate crisis. We can't just be fixated with carbon, we need to think more broadly, but it's really going to take systematic change to address biodiversity loss. It needs all of us to work together to make this difference. So thank you very much. I will stop there.
Wow, Jane, thank you so much. You spoke so well and so quickly on everything in one go. There was so much to absorb there, but so many points.
It wasn't too much.
Never too much. We love too much here, but we can focus down on them now anyway. But my first question to you, I guess, would be, you were saying there, you know, lovely. I love the boy and the horse and the mole picture used at the end. It's so lovely, but it so encapsulates how you might feel after looking at all that information. Gosh, how do I help? How do I get involved? So my first question, you touched a bit there on the 4 things that we can do, but what can our alumni do specifically today, this week? Take action, something small. What can they do to tackle this with you?
I know, and it can be really overwhelming. And the answer I often give to this is do more by doing less. So don't mow the lawn. I mean, it's a great time of year to start to say these things. You know, don't mow the lawn or clear out last year's old leaves. Leave some space for nature. If you don't have a garden, then it's about your behavior, what you're doing. So as I said, buying and consuming less, producing less, making less of an impact in your own day-to-day lives, and yeah, getting involved with local communities, making a fuss about this at work. You know, a lot of biodiversity actions that happen in organizations come from a really passionate individual that will just keep on nagging about it until the CEO or the boss decides they need to give them some space to do something about it. So I suppose the other way is to hassle your local politicians and ask what they're doing about biodiversity loss, and how they're facing the biodiversity crisis. So I think, you know, we can sometimes feel like it's too big, it's too overwhelming, but there are things that individuals can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I know mammies across the country would be delighted with you when they say, clear your plate, it'll save biodiversity. So
absolutely, we hate food waste.
Exactly, yeah. No, and I'm going on from that, from the individual onto, let's say, our title of our webinar, Opening the Front Gate, to what Trinity is doing. You spoke a little bit about COP15, the biodiversity equivalent to the climate COP. UN, there was the University Alliance program that you spoke about that Trinity joined in December. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Trinity's pledge means there and what they're doing with that?
Yeah, so Trinity joined this international network of nature positive universities, and we made this official pledge to work towards a global nature positive goal. And the idea of this is to do what I was saying, to halt, prevent and reverse nature loss through addressing our own impacts and restoring ecosystems that are harmed by the activities that we do as a university. And I suppose this is a really sort of public taking ownership. You know, we're tackling our own supply chains, looking at our operational impacts on nature. So what that means in Trinity means that my office is working with the procurement office, with estates and facilities, to understand our impacts, understand our dependencies, to minimize our negative impacts, and to emphasize our positive ones. And I think often, you know, we think about what can we do for biodiversity, what can we do for nature. It's about managing a small piece of land. We don't have massive tracts of land in Trinity, where most of us are in the city centre in a small footprint. So there's not a huge amount we can do to provide habitat or to restore habitat. We're doing a little bit of that as well, of course, but really it's through how we operate, and these supply chain impacts are really, really important. So So tackling that is one side of it. And the other side of it is, we're an educational institution. So we have a really important role to play in educating staff, students, alumni, and the general public about biodiversity loss, and working with other organisations. So other third level institutions, with Dublin City Council, with businesses, to really, we're all working on this together. We all have the same challenges that we're trying to tackle. So making that partnership and working together, we're going to be much stronger than going it alone.
Absolutely, that's great. I mean, it's such a great achievement that they're part of it. It's there with, it's the University of Oxford as well. So
they're leading the initiative. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's fabulous to see that they're at the forefront with this, and obviously with you at the helm, it's great. And one thing that a lot of people might remember is over lockdown, one of the things so associated, I guess, with biodiversity is the rewilding of the front gate. And I remember when this happened, and it happens cross country, even I'm thinking of Dunsany Castle and the baron who owns that there, the young rocker baron, rewilding his estate. And it was really controversial. It was really contended in the media. And rewilding is quite a controversial issue. Can you talk a bit about why rewilding? I think it's great. I think it's beautiful. But why rewilding gets such negative press sometimes, and how do you manage that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think one of the issues is that rewilding means different things to different people. So, not mowing part of your lawn or leaving an area to itself, that can be rewilding, but rewilding can also be actively managing an area for wildlife, specifically introducing species that maybe aren't there anymore. So this concept of rewilding is really quite broad. So I know down in Dunsany, they're kind of just leaving it to itself. The introduction of animals that have previously gone extinct can be quite controversial. So there's a lot of controversy regarding introduction of top predators. So often top predators have been lost, gone extinct, and the reintroduction of them is, thought to bring ecological systems back into balance, but that can be quite controversial. I suppose, I think that's the more controversial end. I think the other end of kind of leaving somewhere to look after itself, or what we did here in Trinity, which was creating the ornamental meadows. It's a lot of people's perceptions. So I think people have different views on buildings and art. It's the same for nature. So I agree with you. I love the way the flowers look at the front gates there. But for some people, that just doesn't look right. It looks messy. It's different. So I think there's that can add to the controversy as well. It's just different views of how things should look. And in Trinity, we've had this long history of these very traditional management styles, so very traditionally maintained green spaces, and that looks great to some people. To other people, they'd love to see a bit more nature and a bit more wildlife in there. So we have to balance those things.
Absolutely. I know. And I know there'll be a lot of gardeners tuning in today that'll be asking questions like, how do I do biodiversity when I love doing my gardening as well? So it's an interesting one for people. But
it is. And I think that link as well, between gardening and biodiversity is one that we talk about a lot, because I think of what we've done at Front Gate. I'm pointing that way, sorry, because it's behind me.
It is behind you.
It really is. It is gardening. We're in the middle of the city. We've not created a wild community. What we've created is a more biodiverse meadow than the grassland that was there beforehand. So, and it's really, as I said before, it's about influence, it's about opening up the conversation, it's about really getting people talking about nature in the middle of the city.
Absolutely, yeah. And on your point of nature, and as you said, the pictures that you put up of Ireland when you were talking about how bad the biodiversity problem is in Ireland, I think a lot of people would be quite shocked to hear that, because we're almost greenwashing ourselves with the tourist pictures that we have of rolling hills. We could go out for a walk after now in the gorgeous sun in Dublin today, and we could take a walk along the countryside and we would completely not understand that there'd be a biodiversity problem. And Ireland's actually doing quite poorly in Europe as a country for biodiversity. So how do you even advocate for these problems when you have a country that's so green and basically it's hard to even communicate that there's a problem?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And, as you say, you step out the door, you still see green, you still hear birds singing. It's hard to believe that we're in a crisis, but we are. Trees are continually being felled, green spaces are being developed. And I think one of the things as well is this, we call it a kind of a shifting baseline syndrome. So a colleague of mine often talks about when she was a kid, if you stepped out of the back door at night and you got the light on, you get dive bombed by moths and other insects that are flying around the lights in the back door, or you leave the bathroom window open overnight and with the light on and the bathroom's full of moths in the morning. And that just doesn't happen anymore. So it's that people have sort of forgotten that happened, and the next generation have no idea that happened. So we're continually shifting our baseline of what we think is normal, and the current normal is very different from that one in the past. So it is hard to see, and it's been equated with the loss of biodiversity is usually silent, so we don't hear it. It's usually invisible. So we don't necessarily see it, and it usually involves organisms that are quite mobile, so it's hard to track. So for example, with the pollinators that I work on, one of the big questions I get is, well, is the pollinator plan working? Have we reversed pollinator decline in Ireland? And the answer is actually we don't know. We've done an awful lot. There's a lot of more area of Ireland being managed in a pollinator friendly way, but we don't know if we've reversed decline of the organisms because they're so mobile, they're so hard to survey, they're difficult to keep track of. So I think it is difficult for us to really grasp that this is such an extreme loss that we're going through. And I think the problem is we could get to a point where we can't get back. And I think that's people talk about tipping points. We don't know exactly where that tipping point is. When do we lose enough biodiversity that systems no longer function? We can see it to some extent when you clear a floodplain and build houses on it, and there's no nature there anymore, it's just concrete, and they flood. And it didn't used to flood because there was trees and tree roots holding the water and everything. So we can see when it's completely gone. But as a country, it's difficult to see. What we really need is policies. We need departments. We need organisations that work together, not in contradiction to each other. And that's what we've tried to do, as I say, with the pollinator plan.
Absolutely. And hopefully you have a whole converted audience here who will be rallying behind you whenever you go next to state with your policy. Anyway, fabulous. Great, Jane. I have one last question for you, which is, do you have anything in the next few weeks that you would like to promote?
Thank you, Kira. We do. In fact, we have so many of our alumni might remember that Trinity has a Green Week. So this is a focal point in the annual college calendar. It's one of the Students' Union theme weeks. And this year, our office, working with the Student Union and the Green Campus, we're organising a whole range of events under the banner of Healthy Planet, Healthy People. The following week after Green Week is the Health and Sports Week. So we can really emphasise this link between nature and humanity. And so we have a whole series of events coming up. So it's the week of the 20th to the 24th of March. We have a climate entrepreneurship event, a green careers event, researchers networking and showcase event, transport forum, greening healthcare. We've got climate comedy. We've got a minister coming in to take questions from the students, public panels, games. There's a lot going on. So if people want to get involved or attend any of our events, then please do keep an eye on our socials.
Wow, well, I'll have to say I'm very intrigued by the climate comedy. That sounds very fun.
It's going to be great.
Fantastic, great, Jane. Well, we're going to take it over to our audience Q&A now. We have quite a few questions in here. So the first one I'm going to ask is, which type of bees are at risk of extinction in Ireland? And if it is solitary bees, they are so difficult to identify. How do we go about this?
Gosh, that's a really hard question. So the majority of our bees in Ireland are solitary, and the ones in general, the ones that are most at risk are those that have a naturally restricted distribution. Now I say generally, some of our common species are also in decline, and it's exactly what I said. It's really hard to monitor how they're doing. One, because they're mobile, small, and only active for a short part of the year. But the other reason is because it takes real expertise to identify them, and there's only a handful of people on the island of Ireland who are experts in identifying these different species. So it is really hard to do that, and I think what we're trying to promote in the pollinator plan is that actions that will benefit all different species of bees, but also other species of pollinators, so like hoverflies and butterflies and other flies. It is a challenge. I don't know if I answered the question there, but
I think you did. You answered it perfectly. As grand. So we're going to go on to our next question, which is from Gina. So she says, very interesting talk. What role do deer play in biodiversity with all the controversy in the news, re the deer overpopulation problem in Ireland?
Thank you. Yeah, the deer. I think because when any species becomes the population becomes large, then it can have impacts. So when you have a large population of deer, particularly if they are constrained to a particular area, then that can have impacts through trampling, through grazing. For the native species of deer, there can be impacts in terms of competition, in terms of hybridization. I mean, one of the problems with some of the deer populations is that they can compound other problems. So, for example, rhododendron is a very invasive plant species in woodlands. It isn't very tasty to the deer, so the deer browse around the rhododendron and leave it and eat all the other things that might compete with the rhododendron, all the other plants, the native plant species, and so that exacerbates the problem with this invasive plant that's then allowed to grow. So there's lots of complexity in terms of the impacts of deer, and really it's because the populations of the deer are too big for the spaces that they're able to inhabit, and this is because we've had this habitat loss, and so you've got this constrained space in which the deer can exist. So yes, then there's the need to control the size of the population of the deer because of the size of the space in which they're inhabiting.
Gosh, wow. Rhododendrons, I wouldn't thought that they were dangerous to deer at all, but they're so pretty, unfortunately. So
that's a whole nother talk.
I know, that is a different talk altogether. So the next one is from Margaret here, and she says, great talk and thank you, but how do you engage big corporations to engage in actual ways that will show commitment and meaningful results?
That's another really good question. Thank you. There's carrots and sticks, I suppose, in terms of big organizations getting involved. Sometimes they want to get involved to get that sort of first competitor advantage, to show their customers that they're going beyond the things that they have to do, which at the moment, environmentally, there's a lot of rules around climate and carbon and emissions, but not necessarily strong rules around biodiversity. So if they can get ahead of the curve and ahead of the competition, that might be one reason that they would engage. Another reason is that they know that legislation is coming down the line, that soon they're going to have to engage with this. So again, getting in there early. And the other reason, as I mentioned, is often it's an individual within that corporation really just being a passionate advocate, and that can make such a difference, is that they just keep bringing it up, keep putting it on the table, and really, as I said earlier, every organization has impacts and dependencies, and it's how important they consider them to be. A lot of big organizations are now very much influenced by ESG, so environmental and social governance, and so that's where the sort of the climate part is coming in. But as I say, the biodiversity part is more difficult. I often say climate is much easier to tackle because we know what the problem is. There's too much carbon in the atmosphere. So we know what the solution is getting rid of the carbon in the atmosphere. I know that's not easy, but biodiversity is much more complex because it's very site specific, and it's very variable, and it depends what element of biodiversity you're looking at. So it's actually quite hard to measure as well. So getting corporations involved is challenging, but it's starting to happen. And I'm involved in a initiative that's been seed funded by the government, but is a Business for Biodiversity Ireland platform, which is to give businesses that want to do something for biodiversity the advice and the guidance for how to do it. So it's slowly starting.
Great, perfect. Start is a start enough anyway. Small start is a good start. Anyway, and so your presentation was fabulous, Catherine says, and very enlightening. It is clear that we're losing species at a rapid rate and is very worrying, but is there any evidence of new species being evolved to help reduce the loss, i.e. filling the space left by lost species?
That's a really good question. The answer is probably yes, but not rapidly enough. So I think the problem, one thing that people often point out is that species go extinct all the time. I mean, if you look on a long enough timescale, think about the dinosaurs, they're not here anymore. So on a long enough timescale, species are always going extinct. And the planet has been through 5 mass extinctions through geological time until now. The problem is that at the moment, species are going extinct at a much faster rate than they were before humans were around. And so the rate of evolution of new species isn't keeping up with the rate of extinction of old species. And, in this context, people often say, we need to save the planet. My answer is the planet will be fine. It might take a few million years. It's us that we need to save. It's humanity that we need to save, and our relationship with the planet is a really important part of that.
Amazing, great. Another question that we have here is, I think is a great one, just talking about the local, is Miriam asks, can tidy towns make an impact by creating wild meadows using locally sourced seeds?
Absolutely, and tidy towns have actually been amazing through the last I'd say the last decade, really changing from that mindset of neat and tidy to embracing wildlife and embracing biodiversity. And they've worked really closely with us through the pollinator plan, and we now have, I think, over 200 tidy towns organizations that enter a specific award for pollinators. So yes, I had this question the other day: what impact does a little patch of nature in a city or in a town make? Does it really make a difference? And I think it does if there's lots of them, because then it provides a network of habitats, particularly for species that can cope with highly modified human environments, which is basically what urban areas are. So yes, little patches, urban meadows, and I love that you said there with locally sourced wildflower seed, because that's really important. A lot of the kind of the commercially available wildflower seed contains species mixes that don't naturally occur together or aren't from a local area, and even in some cases some species that aren't native to Ireland. So locally sourced wildflower seed. But the other thing is that often the seed is there in the seed bank, you just need to give it the opportunity to come through. And the National Biodiversity Data Centre, who lead on the pollinator plan, have some great guidelines for how to do that, available on their website and through pollinators.ie. So yes, it does make a difference. Thank you.
Fabulous. And I think we'll have time for just one more question. Ali asks, how is Trinity doing in comparison to other universities in terms of sustainability and biodiversity, and where do we rank? Great question.
That's a good question. I suppose, Trinity has a long history of being involved in environmental action. So the Green Campus here was established in 1992, and we've been running Green Week since 2003. So there's been a long history of action. I suppose in comparison to other universities, we've all still got a long way to go. I think we're all sort of at the beginning of this journey of mainstreaming this issue, and it actually being something that's now on the agenda of the governing authorities or the boards of the universities. So it's becoming much more important for all institutions. In terms of ranking, I'm not really bothered about rankings. As I said, I think we need to work together. It's very hard to rank an institution on how they're doing because that depends on how you measure it. I'd say we're doing pretty well compared to other organisations. We're working with the IUA, the Irish Universities Association, on the island of Ireland. We're working with this international network that I mentioned earlier, the Nature Positive Universities Network. And we're trying to learn, to collaborate, to share knowledge, and to progress together.
Perfect. Well, yeah, we're not competitive in that sense, but we're doing enough, but we're not doing too much right now. But yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jane. This has been fantastic.
Very well.
It's been really lovely to have you on, and thank you for giving so much of your time and expertise and knowledge to this. We've learned so much about biodiversity and everything that you've brought, your slides and all of your answers to all of the wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Of course. We'll have you back anytime. So I would also like to thank in the alumni office, Garma Singh, who is behind the scenes on the tech for this webinar, working really hard to make sure this all runs smoothly. I'd also like to thank our audience for participating today and for all of your lovely questions and fabulous participation throughout the webinar. I would also just like to bring your attention to our next webinar, if you would be so good to join us. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, the 29th of March at 1 p.m. It'll be all about the journey of an idea, Trinity's young alumni entrepreneurs, with Ken Finnegan, CEO of Tangent. Now, if you have any more questions about anything that you've seen today, please contact alumni@tcd.ie. The details of the upcoming webinar will be on the alumni website, which is www.tcd.ie/alumni. And thank you so much for joining today. If you would like any more information on the research that Jane has talked about today, there will be a follow-up email with all the links to current research, to videos, and any other excerpts that might be relevant. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope we'll see you again next month. Until then, take care and have an absolutely lovely day.